Ceasefire in Syria, but not for Islamic State and the jihadists formerly known as Nusra Front. A leading figure exclusively tells Newsnight that America and Russia can't carry out their plan to hit them without hitting their own allies.
It's not uncommon to have one family with members from several groups living in the same house. They go fight and they come back to their houses, with their families, with civilians. JFS is deeply embedded in society and cannot be singled out in any way.
Good evening. Just before the ceasefire in Syria, which started 6 hours ago, President Assad vowed to take back the whole of Syria from rebel groups in an interview broadcast on state media. The 7-day ceasefire includes improved humanitarian access and plans for joint US-Russian targeting of hardline extremists. But a potential pitfall is how to separate nationalist rebels from jihadists, especially the grouping formerly known as the Nusra Front, which has been playing a vital role in the battle for Aleppo. Our reporter Secunda Kamani has had an exclusive interview with a representative of the jihadi group. Here's his report.
On the Muslim festival of sacrifice, more bloodshed as regime planes bombed rebel-held Aleppo ahead of the ceasefire coming into effect. The deal is meant to bring a week of peace, allowing humanitarian aid into besieged areas. It's no long-term solution, though. Assad today performed triumphal Eid prayers in a district newly captured from rebels and vowed to take the entire country. Opposition representatives haven't formally signed a deal, and many in rebel areas, whilst glad of any pause in fighting, are sceptical. One of the key elements in the deal is that if the ceasefire holds for a week, instead of Assad's air force, America and Russia will set up a joint command, they say, to target ISIS and the jihadist group Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, or JFS. JFS were until recently called Jabhat al-Nusra and were al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria. JFS, though, officially severed ties with al-Qaeda. Unlike ISIS, they've fought alongside mainstream rebel groups and have been key in breaking the regime's siege of Aleppo. The JFS spokesman answered questions I emailed to him about the plans to target them.
The question is, where do they think JFS exists? They're not on another planet. They are part of the Syrian society. It's not uncommon to have one family with members from several groups living in the same house. They go fight and they come back to their houses, with their families, with civilians. JFS is deeply embedded in society and cannot be singled out in any way. They don't govern an area on their own. They're not exclusive to any particular location. And America and Russia know this very, very well.
This map shows areas under control by different factions in Syria. ISIS territory is clearly demarcated, as is that of the regime. But JFS jointly controls areas alongside mainstream rebel groups, and even this ignores the complicated alliances in many places. It seems the US is trying to split the other rebels away from JFS, but they're seen as a powerful ally.
It's seen as a Syrian movement. It's seen as standing up for Syrians and fighting the regime. They're an effective fighting force, particularly in recent offensives in Aleppo. And so it makes no sense to peel away from them, because actually what you're doing is weakening your own position by doing that. And in some ways, I think actually some of these Syrian rebel groups could see this as a divide and rule tactic by the great powers and completely ignore it.
JFS has concentrated on attacking the Assad regime, but some in Western security establishments say despite the official break, they're still al-Qaeda and still a danger, something their spokesman denies.
We've been extremely clear about our split, but I'll say it again, JFS is not an affiliate of al-Qaeda. We're a completely independent body working to establish the common goals of the revolutionary forces in Syria.
I asked if that means they oppose events like 9/11.
Now, as for 9/11, that happened 15 years ago and is completely irrelevant to what is happening in Syria today. Would you ask Obama to be responsible for policies that the United States had in Japan or Vietnam or South America under previous administrations? Obviously not. Our policies are clear, and that is all that matters.
A coalition of other rebel groups have tonight indicated they will abide by the ceasefire, but they've also strongly criticised the plans to attack JFS. This could be one of the key flaws that leads to the ceasefire's downfall.
JFS was not established to fight anyone except the Assad regime and whoever allies with him. Who are the terrorists? Hezbollah and the PKK, both terrorist organizations according to the US. And they're actively and openly fighting in Syria. Why are they not targeted?
For now, the ceasefire appears to be holding, but for many in cities like Aleppo, a temporary peace is not enough.
My wife told me that after sunset we will go out because it's a ceasefire. Now we are able to. Now I can go with you and our daughter without being afraid about or scared about her. A little bit of life, but in general we want better. We want some. What we want, it's a freedom, okay, to remove Assad.
Families tonight have some respite from the bombs, but for how long?
An extraordinary story of medicine under fire. Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Farah Al-Attasi, a spokeswoman for the Syrian Opposition High Negotiations Committee. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Can we just very first talk about what you make of the ceasefire? Do you think the deal is a good one?
First of all, the HNC did not receive an official copy of the US-Russian agreement yet. So we cannot really comment on it on an official way. We need a copy of this agreement so we can analyze it. We can discuss any defaults in terms of enforcement measurements. And then we can give an official statement and response about how do we view this agreement. However, from previous agreements between the Russian and the American, the HNC and other Syrian opposition group respond positively towards any international efforts that will really halt violence in Syria, specifically putting pressure on the Assad regime and his allies in stopping the bombardment and airstrikes against civilian targets, including the Russian themselves. So if this agreement really enforced fully by the regime, absolutely we welcome it.
And we saw, you probably didn't see, but we saw images of children out playing on swings in Aleppo tonight, just the very instantaneously different feeling that they have, albeit that might only be one for 7 days. And I wonder what you think will be the progress of this. I mean, what do you think the Russians' intention is?
As I said, from previous experience of prior agreements between the Russians and the Americans, it was the Russians who breached the agreements that they made themselves. Even the day after the agreement was announced, the Russian conducted an airstrikes on the suburb of Idlib, and we have around 15 Syrian civilians were killed in that airstrikes by the Russians themselves. So I said it's premature really to assess how this agreement will be workable on the ground. We hope it will be workable on the ground. We pray it will be workable on the ground. Even Secretary Kerry today, he raised some suspicions and he said, you know, it might not work well, but we have to wait. It just started, and I said we need to see how the regime will abide with this agreement. The armed forces, they always welcomed the channel of the humanitarian aid, and they said they are ready to protect the channel of the humanitarian aid, and they will reflect positively towards this.
Earlier in the programme, we had a representative of the former Nusra Front, JFS, on the programme saying that actually, because they were very much in the forefront in the battle for Aleppo, and they are, as it were, embedded in different neighbourhoods and so forth, that the idea of separating them out as a legitimate target as opposed to moderate opposition is impossible. What do you say to that?
I'm not a military expert. I can comment on political issues. However, geographically and strategically, that statement is true and realistic, because it's so hard to really isolate the civilians places, because a lot of these places and areas are besieged by the Syrian regime and Iranian militia. So you cannot really recognize the Free Syrian Army from other armed, maybe fanatic groups. So somehow it's intertwined, and that's why we read today a statement by most of the military armed groups on the ground. In Article number 8, they are saying clearly that the agreement exclude Fatah al-Sham and some other forces from the agreement. However, they did not talk about other militia fighting beside the regime, like Hezbollah, like Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. I mean, all of these forces are on the ground, and all of them intertwined.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight.